Are the Winnipeg Jets finally going back to the model that once made them a powerhouse in the West? Is Winnipeg finally recommitting to draft and develop? Is Winnipeg's future guaranteed? We're going to talk about all of this and more on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. But most of all, we just really love and appreciate your support. Now, on tonight's episode, like I said, got a couple of things to talk about. But the main thing that I want to tackle as kind of like an aside and maybe an interesting short discussion is if the Jets are going back to draft and develop, the model that once made them a truly successful franchise. And I think over the years, there's been a question about the Jets when it comes to developing, because as far as drafting is concerned, the Jets actually make pretty cool picks, right? Barring a few instances where you might look at the draft pick and say, that guy maybe didn't have as much potential as some of the other players taken either before or right after him. You might look at some of those and say, well, that's not so great. But for the most part, the Jets have recently drafted pretty well. I would say there are only a handful of exceptions where I feel like the Jets left talent on the board. And that kind of comes with an interesting question because, for all of the draft picks that the Jets have made, you can probably imagine that there aren't that many that have actually made Winnipeg's roster. And that's been a consistent issue over the last few years. Winnipeg really hasn't been using ELCs all that aggressively. The Jets have acquired guys through trade. They've relied on veterans. But when it comes to new blood, Winnipeg isn't really sourcing stuff from within. Cole Perfetti is obviously one of the rare examples. Dylan Sandberg, another one. But if you look at the rest of the prospects and stuff that the Jets have drafted, how many do you think are actually close to cracking an NHL lineup? That's why I'm kind of excited about the current crop of kids. McGroarty, Lambert, and Chisholm to an extent, maybe DiVincentis down the road. A lot of these players seem like they might be something. Salamanson is another guy that I think is really worth keeping an eye on. But I guess when it comes to drafting and developing, it kind of comes with, a double-edged sword, right? Because Winnipeg is in a spot where the existing core is expiring and you don't really have a lot of resources to bring most of it back. And so when the Jets are trying to balance ELCs, thrown into this mixture, it gets a little bit tricky. And I think where the Jets have recently struggled is that when they fill at the bottom of the roster, oftentimes those spots go to guys like Sam Gagner, Kevin Stenlund, etc. And I like Gagner. I think he's actually a really smart signing. But if that's what you're filling your bottom six with, you are sealing off opportunities for internal promotions and stuff. And that's where I think Winnipeg has really closed off a lot of doors for some of their prospects. Heinola really didn't get much of a chance. And while he has had some issues in some of the stints that he was given, I feel like Logan Stanley maybe had more of a chance to really prove himself and also didn't really accomplish much. Sandberg, I would say, of the three has been the most impressive, but I feel like he was also given the most leash. And so for me, it's kind of like, okay, if you give Sandberg a lot of leash, that's great. Why aren't we seeing that for other prospects? What's the holdup? And I think that is where the Jets have really struggled to graduate prospects from the draft pool to an NHL roster spot. And I think going forward for the Jets, if they are entering a more budget-conscious mode, that means that they basically have to hit on every single pick and have it become an NHLer, which is just a very low probability. It's hard to do that. Obviously, over the last 10 years, NHL teams have gotten much better when it comes to identifying legitimate NHL talent, but I feel like for Winnipeg, while that has gotten better and maybe they're, evaluating some really good prospects like Lambert and McGroarty, there's still a fair amount of risk that these guys don't really reach the potential that I think a lot of people have ascribed to them. And if they don't, Winnipeg's kind of in trouble. Barlow is like the most pro-ready of the prospects, I would say, of the like really young kids that the Jets have. But Chaz Lucius, his career has kind of been thus far derailed by injuries, which is really a shame because he has among the highest scoring potentials of all the kids the Jets have drafted. And you really hope that he stays healthy this year and can play a full season or at least most of it. But we know that that might not be the case. And so I do kind of worry a little bit. There's sort of that voice in the back of my head that says Winnipeg might need to prepare for, the scenario where this prospect pool really doesn't yield the right core. And I feel like the Jets need to be smart about how they build around them and who they're bringing in to really lead the group forward, because you can't just have lots of ELCs and, not much of a backbone. The 2017-2018 Jets were really successful because you had a good young core, and then you had ELCs that kind of filled in the gaps around it and gave you surplus value to work with. And that's where I think the Jets could really stand to make some gains. But I guess until they kind of optimize the roster, until they start to really see what these kids are going to be in a few seasons, it's hard to kind of really project that far out. So I think for now, Winnipeg is kind of in a holding pattern, which does make me wonder if, for the next couple of seasons, Winnipeg takes a bit of a step back. I don't think it would actually be the worst thing. I would not mind Winnipeg adding more draft talent, especially upper end talent, because I think the Jets could really use with a couple more marquee pieces for the future. Not that the pool is bad now. I think it's actually pretty decent. But, for the future, the far future, you might need another game-breaking presence, because we're looking at the last years of guys like Ehlers, Scheifele, Connor, Hellebuck, all of that core is kind of winding down. And obviously Ehlers and Connor still have some more time, but how much longer after that, I really don't know. So for Winnipeg, I think it's really imperative that they are smart about how they draft and that they actually make sure that these kids make the NHL, because if they don't, Winnipeg's roster is going to be really bare bones in the coming seasons. But we'll, call that for a tomorrow problem and sort of, walk throughout the offseason and the future what prospects I think are most likely to make that jump and really become part of Winnipeg's future backbone. But before we go any further, I did want to also transition topics and kind of talk about more offseason stuff. Obviously, the NHL is still very active. Lots of teams are making moves, and there were some more interesting signings that I thought were kind of worth spotlighting. Before we go any further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right, just $20, and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. Or if you're a Jays fan, maybe you want to bet on where the Jays are going to finish in the AL East. As an O's fan, I'm going to tell you it's not going to be first place. Just kidding, maybe it is. Technically not impossible, but I think we know where things are going to stand. But no matter what team you root for, and don't hate me because I'm an O's fan, but you can always be sure that when you're betting with FanDuel, you're betting on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And when you win, best of all, you get paid instantly. And who doesn't love instant gratification? There's no better place to bet on the MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are continuing to dive into off-season discussions. We just talked a little bit about Winnipeg's interesting future and why it's kind of high risk, high reward in a lot of ways. But, obviously, in the short term, around the NHL, there have been a number of interesting signings, deals, the sorts of stuff that a lot of people spend tons of time talking about, and most of it ends up not mattering. But I think a few of these signings are actually pretty impactful. One that I'm keeping a very close eye on is San Jose's signing of Filip Zadina. And Zadina, I think, has maybe gotten a bit of an unfair rap since joining the Detroit Red Wings. Obviously, when he was taken so high up a couple of seasons ago, it was thought that he was going to be a franchise-altering presence. And since then, he's kind of found himself in weird spots where he has struggled to move up the lineup. And I think the coaching staff doesn't really have a defined role that they're happy with him, playing. And when you look at who he's played with, Detroit's surrounding cast has been, let's just say, not ideal. And so I think Zadina has kind of found himself pigeonholed a little bit. And it's an interesting gamble, right? For one season, for 1.1 million, I feel like you really can't go wrong. My guess is that Zadina is going to move to San Jose and kind of start to light it up. He does a lot of the smart details and plays really well. And if he doesn't have as much pressure and can maybe start to kind of, I don't know, just have fun again, I think you might see a different version of him playing for the Sharks team. Not that Detroit hurt him or anything and really mistreated him, but I feel like the Wings just weren't going to make the most of his skill sets. And so maybe it's time for a team like San Jose that's young, that's developing, and that's kind of tanking and looking to really give players like Zadina a chance to become part of their future core. And with Zadina, you do wonder at some point if, he has a really good season, maybe the Sharks could even flip him because, given their timeline, I don't know if he necessarily fits long term. My guess is yes, because he's still very young, but maybe some of the capital that they could exchange for him, if he starts off really well with the Sharks, would give him a chance to go to a contender and really take flight. I don't know. My feeling is like if he does really well, you start to look at whether you want to bring him back long term because the Sharks don't really have a lot of talent to rally around. And if they were to add somebody like Zadina and he actually really takes flight and becomes a guy that fans really adore, it's kind of hard to say that you want to trade him. I mean, it's not a league where you can find young superstars like him just hanging around. And he's not a superstar yet, but he does still have some potential to become a pretty good NHLer. So a very interesting signing, very low risk, very high reward, or potentially high reward, and one that I personally would have loved to have seen the Jets go for. But I get why they didn't. It's okay. Now, another interesting signing that I think is worth talking about is Connor Bedard. No, I'm just kidding. Everyone knows he was signing that ELC. But one of our rivals, actually, I would say, has one of the more curious contracts, and that is the Minnesota Wild. They ended up re-signing Philip Gustafsson for 3 seasons, and I feel like this one might be going under the radar just a little bit, but Gustafsson's coming in at 3.6, 3.7 million per season, and I feel like for what Gustafsson is, that is pretty darn good value. Obviously, a goalie like him may not have the longest sample size. You might not be seeing, huge numbers from him in his past career, but let me tell you, man, last year he was pretty lights out for the Wild, maybe one of their best goalies. And, for the next 3 seasons, he is basically that bridge to Jesper Wallstedt. And obviously Wallstedt is really one of the most talked about goalie prospects in the entire NHL. And I think with having Gustafsson in between, you're really not looking at a bad situation here where he's going to be a great stopgap. He's going to help you be playoff competitive. And more than likely, Wallstedt is going to take over in maybe 2 to 3 seasons and become your franchise number 1. But in the meantime, you've got a really good value goalie on a very fair deal for 3 seasons. I really don't think that if you're a Wild fan, you are complaining whatsoever. Now, the last deal that I think is kind of interesting to consider is Tanner Jeannot. And I don't know if I would necessarily call this interesting for the right reason, but Tanner Jeannot signed a 2-year, $5 million deal with the Tampa Bay Lightning. And I just find it funny because Tampa Bay exchanged so many parts for Jeannot and ended up not really doing much in the postseason. They got 4 picks or something out of that whole thing to Nashville. It was a very strange trade. And when it happened, it was sure, a lot of the picks were kind of like junky picks, stuff that you're not really expecting NHLers out of. But it just feels like Jeannot has kind of been one of those players where you see maybe it's a bit of a sunk fallacy cost, right? Or sunk cost fallacy. You've already invested a lot of draft capital in him, and you have to bring him back for, a reasonably pricey contract for his contribution so far. $2.5 million or a little over that per season might not seem like that much, but when you're a team like Tampa that's really strapped for cash and cap space, I do wonder if that's maybe not the most ideal signing. But hey, Tampa Bay has won cups before. Maybe he's the secret ingredient. Who knows? On that kind of note, I thought it would also be, interesting to talk about teams that I think are off-season winners. We'll talk about a few of those teams and what makes them a winner in just a little bit. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for joining us for these closing thoughts of tonight's episode of Locked On Jets. I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about teams that I thought might be considered offseason winners. And actually, you know what? The first one I'm going to say is the Winnipeg Jets. I think thus far, Winnipeg has generally done pretty good. With some caveats, right? It's not perfect. Nothing ever is. But let's start off with the Dubois trade, right? I feel like Winnipeg actually made out pretty well with this deal. Iafallo is a little bit of a cap dump, but he's actually a pretty productive one. Velarde is a very talented young forward and somebody who I'm personally a big fan of. And Kupari really shouldn't be discounted. I know that he might not be the sexiest name thrown about in this deal, but as a guy who might actually be a pretty decent upgrade for your third or fourth line, I really can't hate it. The reason that there might be some qualifications to this about the true value of this deal is because there are, obviously issues like you've got Velarde's injury history and him only signing for 2 seasons now. That's a little bit worrying. Iafallo is also a little bit pricey. He's like, $4.2 million, something around that range. So not cheap for his contract. And Kupari might be one of those guys that's like decent, but nothing really special. But all that said, considering who the Jets were icing in positions that those guys are likely to play this upcoming season, I think the Jets did a really good thing upgrading in a number of key areas in their forward grouping. I think that they got deeper. I think that they added skill. And in general, the Jets forward group looks a little more balanced now. So with the shedding of Blake Wheeler, hopefully the promotion of Nikolai Ehlers, the return of Cole Perfetti, and the new additions up front, I feel like this team is going to be better than it was last season. But the defense is still kind of a sore spot. And of course, Scheifele and Hellebuck's contract situations hang over like a bit of a dark cloud. But that's a problem that they're just going to have to deal with at some point this season. I don't know when it'll be, but hopefully it'll be before we watch them walk away for nothing. Another team that I think had an interesting offseason that I might say is kind of an improvement is the Nashville Predators, insofar as Barry Trotz just seems very content to burn it all down and start over. Now, I will say the Duchesne buyout was kind of odd. I feel like the way that they handled that was a little bit interesting. But other than that, I feel like Nashville has kind of been purging a lot of what you might consider to be driftwood for them. Stuff that doesn't really fit their roster long term. And look, I don't know that Trotz has like the best plan ever, but I feel like, generally speaking, if he listens to the right people, his mindset about finding really star talent at the top levels of the draft would probably be the right approach. Now, how he builds around that's going to be a really critical piece. And that part we have no idea, because in the past, Trotz did like his grinders, and he did have some really obvious blind spots with some of his deployments and stuff when he was with the Cap. So I'm going to be honest, I don't know what he values when it comes to actually building a team from the ground up, but we're going to get a really good look over at it over the next couple of years. And I would say I can't really hope for their success for obvious reasons, but they are an interesting experiment to say the least. Another team that I think really upgraded and did a smart thing here is the team that actually got Matt Duchene, the Dallas Stars. Dallas kind of knows that they're sort of in the waning seasons of that team's core. And so I feel like this signing, it's not going to be like a game-breaking, game-changing signing, but if you're looking for a really solid top 6 player who can give you depth down the middle, you really can't go wrong with this particular acquisition. I feel like, they did improve. I think adding him to your top 6, maybe your second line, is going to make your top 9 pretty deep, and Dallas was already very skilled to begin with. This is just like a team that's got lots of old guys, but they're really good old guys. So I think they're going to be a real pain this year, and I'm hoping that the Jets have all that they need to at least try and get by them, and hopefully, if not get by them, at least play equal to their level. Now, the last team that's worth talking about, they are technically an off-season winner, though I think they're actually a bigger loser because they didn't land Dubois. But the Montreal Canadiens have technically improved in a lot of areas on paper. Lots of kind of like mid-tier signings that maybe gets the team a little bit closer to being less of an eyesore. Montreal is one of those teams that I feel like, they were so linked to Dubois, and then after that, it was just sort of picking up the pieces and hoping to assemble something that would make the fans a little bit less angry. But overall, while I would say that they are technically improved, can we really call them a clear out-and-out winner? Probably not. They didn't get their number 1 target, and that team is still pretty mediocre. But hey, at least they improved, I guess. So cheers to them. But obviously, I want to hear what teams you think have really improved. Maybe you think it's the Kings with Dubois. Maybe you think it's Washington having made some big moves with the roster and really with the coaching staff. Maybe it's the Pens who are trying to salvage something out of what remains of Sidney Crosby. But no matter who you're interested in rooting for or think has had a really big offseason, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to this podcast and drop your comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. But for tonight's show, that is all the time that we have. As a reminder, we do have a very special guest tomorrow. I think you'll really love him. I'm very excited to welcome him to the show. So stay tuned for tomorrow's episode in the afternoon or evening. But like I said, for tonight's show, that is all the time that we have. Thanks so much for making us your first listen of the day. We will see you back here tomorrow. Go Jets, go.